But when we're thinking about stress, I want you to think about this, because when you've got a kid who is discombobulating, which is a very, very important psychiatric term, discombobulation. But Sonia Lupien, who would be a wonderful person actually to come and speak here, Susan, she's fantastic. Anybody heard Sonia Lupien speak? Yeah, she's fabulous. She's from Montreal. And so she has the Centre of, the Canadian Centre of Studies on Stress. And what she has looked at deeply and profoundly is what turns on our physiology, what turns on our stress system. And what she has encountered and described is it's things that are nuts. So novelty, think about yourselves. What turns your stress system on? Novelty, unpredictability, threat to the ego, and sense of loss of control. So I'm pretty good, as those who have heard me know, I'm pretty good about novelty and unpredictability, but my husband, Jim, absolutely sucks when it comes to novelty and unpredictability. He needs the world, and who else is like this? Who needs the world to be predictable? You don't like surprises. You don't like things out of the ordinary. You want things to be, right? To be predictable. And so I don't have so much trouble with that, but when you talk about the latter two, threat to the ego and sense of loss of control, oh, wow. So, you know, threat to the ego, as my dear friend Susan pointed out, you know, when I hear people have heard me before, I go, oh my God, what if I'm not as good as I was the last time? Oh, threat to the ego. Or, you know, what about, oh, you know, that Stuart Shanker is such a great speaker. Oh my God, and I'm speaking on the same page as he is. So threat to the ego. How about, as my daughter-in-law recently encountered, a parent who comes in and says, you're not giving my son in grade 3 enough homework. And she says, well, you know, I find it's my responsibility to cover what we need to do in school, and it's just enrichment and fun things he needs to be done. Well, what do you know? You're just a teacher. Right? Threat to the ego. It didn't bother her nearly as much as it bothered me, mind you. Our sense of loss of control. Well, you know, I didn't know this before I had 5 children, right? So what is happening in our brains? What is happening? And this is another way of looking at the polyvagal theory. What is happening in our brains is that when we sense, perceive, or externally through our senses get a threat, our brains are an adaptive organ. They're a social organ, but they're also adaptive to the universe around them. So if they perceive a threat, we had better have a brain that says, pay attention to that right now. Don't let anything else happen. So you don't digest your food, you don't think about reproduction, you don't think about lots of things because you are in fight-flight physiology. So what happens is you release adrenaline and you release cortisol, but when is it a problem? Well, here it comes. When an anxiety is a problem is when there is no danger there. The reason I have the zebra in that slide that says nuts is there's a great book by Robert Sapolsky called Do Zebras Get Ulcers? Or Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And what's different about us as humans is we turn on our stress physiology, our adrenaline, our cortisol, our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, all the things you learn about in the foundations courses. You turn that on just even by thinking about it. So it gets turned on by being overly cold or painful or other things, but it also gets turned on just by thinking about it. Unlike the zebra, here's the point, the zebra only gets stressed when they're being actually chased by the lion. They're not munching about going, is the lion coming? Is the lion coming? And they don't then break into song. Woo! No, they don't. They don't do that. So why did I just do it? I don't know. Because I'm thinking about the campfire with John playing the guitar. That's why. So here's a system here. The amygdala is deep inside our brain. We've got one on the right, we've got one on the left. In comes a stimulus. It releases signals that go down through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It releases adrenaline, which gets our heart rate going, it gets our sweating, makes our pupils bigger, all kinds of things. It also releases cortisol, which is our stress hormone. Remember I said that those kids where the teacher was burned out, their cortisol levels were higher? So what we want is our cortisol to go up in the morning so we get out of bed, and then down. We worry if the cortisol is up and stays up because it has an influence on not just your ability to learn, so it keeps you in red brain rather than blue brain. Interferes with the development, if you're as a child, with your immune system. It affects your inflammatory processes and has a long, long, long reach. So we need to have something in our brain that's going to turn that cortisol off. We need something that says, okay, the bear's gone, turn it off now. And that's our hippocampus. So those of you who have seen me before know that I'm a child psychiatrist and I use it, and so I like to use my puppets. So I want you to imagine my porcupine puppet here. Was it something I said, Stephen? So my porcupine puppet here is, and who knows how my brain works, but this reminds me of the amygdala. So when the porcupine is firing, it's releasing adrenaline and cortisol. Now he has a good buddy called the hippocampus, right? We all know about the hippocampus. So here is my good buddy, the hippo. Right? So these guys work so well together, except when the porcupine, the amygdala, is firing nonstop. When you're in a tolerable, without buffering, when you're in a toxic state, then you don't have this buffering going on. So what we see instead, as that is going, then we lose the ability to think in our blue brain. So this is the non-teachable moment. And we have to wonder about how do we manage in that non-teachable moment. Well, I'm going to suggest that self-reg is an amazing way to do it. But one thing to talk about before I just finish is our mindset has a huge influence on whether we're going to be open to the concepts of self-reg, if we're going to be open to the framework, the way of thinking of it. So I love the work of Carol Dweck, not all the ways that people have interpreted her work, but the mindset is the psychology of success, and it asks, are people born smart or are people made? She talks about two different mindsets, but here's examples. Winston Churchill repeated a grade during elementary school. Winston Churchill. He was placed in the lowest division of the lowest class. And in fact, he was a very, very bright man. But what he said about examinations was the problem with exams is they keep asking me questions that I don't know the answer to, but don't ask me the questions that I do know the answers to. So in some ways, people would say he wasn't a very good student, was he? Because the good student is the one that figures out how to answer the questions that are going to be asked. So Beethoven is a composer. The teacher called him a hopeless composer. He wrote 5 of his symphonies while deaf. The writer Leo Tolstoy dropped out of college. He was described as both unable and unwilling to learn. So, you know, the growth mindset model says that when you think of yourself as capable, as competent, as able to learn new things, it creates the whole world that you live in. A fixed mindset, though, says that ability cannot change. I can't learn new things. And if something is difficult for me, then I must be not that smart. And they turn off. This is her research. Whereas a growth mindset says ability absolutely can change. Now, one of the things that really struck me about Carol Dweck's work that I want to share with you is what she talked about in terms of praising kids. So she found, now, and I have to say, I would like if she had written achievement or acknowledgement of achievement, acknowledgement rather than praise. But what she talks about, that people are very sensitive to the messages they receive about themselves. For me, it's so important that with self-reg, we are taking the behavior and saying, not this is misbehavior, but this is stress behavior. How can we understand where it has come from? So the way we interact with young people can foster either a growth or a fixed mindset. And what her research has shown is that when you praise the person rather than their effort, so praise ability rather than the effort, and that's the key here. The children work harder, learn more, when you acknowledge the effort that they've put into things. So when you acknowledge the effort they've put into things, rather than praising their ability, you change their mindset. You open the possibility of then talking about what Stuart describes to us. And you're going to be learning much more about here. So when we think through a self-reg lens, we're thinking about what makes us well, what makes a democracy and what makes a democratic person. As we tie in the management of emotion, the focusing of emotion, I see that the self-reg way of thinking, of looking at in what domain is this child being activated or being under-activated? In what domain, and you'll learn more about this, the Shanker method talks about the biological, emotional, cognitive, social, pro-social. In what domain is that child being activated or down-regulated or under-activated? And then every child will do well if they can. Every child will do well if they can. It's not if they want to. It's not that you just have to frickin' incentivize them anymore. It's that we as adults need to be the stress detectives. We need to be the stress detective and read and reframe that behavior. Ask the question, what are the stressors in each of the domains? What are the stressors in those domains? And help the child. Initially, the adult is the co-regulator, but the goal is for the child to be able to identify and reduce those stressors. And then look to see what can I learn about myself about this? And as I've said, the metacognitive metacognition, or wherever you call that, learning about how the students are learning about how the learning's going, is you identify and you become more reflective. And then through that, you use strategies to promote that growth and flourishing. So I'm suggesting to you that we are at a point in history where we really need to be paying attention to our little canaries in the mine shaft, which is our children telling us about their well-being. And that we need to shift the dialogue from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. We need to shift the dialogue to say, how can I make our conditions of learning and home life such that our kids are actually thriving, so that they are learning their purpose and their meaning and imbuing their life with hope and that strong, strong sense of belonging. I'm here today to activate you to say this is the stuff that we're going to be learning about all week in much more depth than I've given you today. And I hope I've given you some little touch of something to think about, a little prickle of, oh, is that right? Because if I have, I've made your neurons fire in new ways, and that's so good. That's so good. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you so much.